a stolen horse, a man driven by debt, pride, and broken land, and a woman who never asked for forgiveness, only survival. When he tracked her down across the harsh western frontier, he expected justice to be simple. Return the horse. End the story. But the moment he looked into her silence, nothing stayed simple anymore. Because she wasn't just a thief. She was already part of a truth he didn't understand yet. And by the time the law arrived at his ranch, the real question was no longer who owned the horse, but who had the right to decide what survival costs. This channel tells stories of the American West cowboys, love in forgotten places, mothers and children fighting impossible odds, and the quiet humanity that survives between hardship and hope. Stories about compassion, forgiveness, and the kind of love that doesn't always look beautiful, but always feels real. This story reminds us that judgment is easy when we only see actions. But understanding takes courage. Sometimes people don't choose between right and wrong. They choose between losing everything or losing themselves. And in that space, humanity becomes the only law that still matters. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who loves Western tales, and subscribe for more stories that bring heart, pain, and redemption from the American frontier.
The morning broke cold and pale over the ranch, the kind of light that didn't warm anything so much as reveal what had already gone wrong. Frost still clung to the wooden fence posts, and the ground held on to last night's storm like it refused to forget. Every step the man took outside the barn sounded heavier than it should have, as if the land itself had thickened overnight. He didn't. There was no time for hesitation anymore. Not with the debt notice still folded in his coat pocket and the auction deadline closing in like a tightening rope. He kept his hands busy because stillness made thoughts louder. The fence line needed repairing, again broken, where the wind had snapped it clean through. Not careless damage, but forceful, final. He worked with the rhythm of someone trying not to think about what came next. Tighten the wire, brace the post, test the tension. The barn behind him creaked softly, a sound he had known all his life, but now interpreted differently, like even familiar things were starting to sound like warnings. The ranch had stopped feeling like land a long time ago. Now it felt like a countdown. Every board he replaced, every nail he drove into wood that resisted him, was another small attempt to delay something inevitable. The bank didn't see the soil the way he did. They didn't hear the wind the same way to them. This place was numbers to him. It was a promise he hadn't been able to keep. His father had died, thinking the ranch would survive him. That was the part that stayed lodged in his mind, like a splinter he couldn't remove. The land had been passed down with the expectation that it would be protected, not bargained away piece by piece. And now here he was, standing in the same dirt, pretending that effort alone could replace money he didn't have. He paused once, resting a hand on the fence post, feeling the vibration of wind travel through the wood. The sky was still dim, not yet fully awake. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cut across the horizon, low and silent. The world looked calm, but it was tea. Nothing was calm anymore. That was when he noticed it. At first, it was subtle. Not missing in a dramatic sense, not immediately obvious, just wrong. The empty space near the barn felt sharper than it should have. He turned his head slowly, as if the answer might correct itself if he didn't rush it. But the corral gate hung slightly open. He did remember leaving it that way. His breath tightened, walked faster now, boots pressing into the damp earth with more urgency. The closer he'd got, the clearer it became. The latch had been cut, not broken by accident, not damaged by weather. Clean, intentional. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. Inside the corral, the space where the horse should have been was empty. For a moment, he didn't move. The absence didn't register as sound or sight. It registered as pressure, like the air had shifted and pressed inward around him. Then the realization settled fully, and everything else followed at once. The horse was gone. Not just any horse. That one. The mare, with the strong build and calm eyes, the one his father had once said was too intelligent to waste on bad riders. The one that had been trained carefully, slowly. The one that responded to voice more than whip, trust more than force. The one that mattered in a way he had never fully admitted, even to himself. His hand tightened around the edge of the gate until his knuckles went pale. This wasn't just theft. It was collapse. He turned quickly, scanning the ground. That part of him, the part the ranch had built into him, since childhood took over without permission. Tracks mattered. Direction mattered. Timing mattered more than anything. The soil near the corral was still soft from the storm. Whoever had taken the horse hadn't waited for conditions to be ideal. They had acted fast. Boot prints cut through the mud. Not many, one set, maybe two at most. The horse hoof marks followed a line that did circle or hesitate. Straight out. Confident pressure, controlled movement. Whoever had taken her knew how to handle a horse. That detail should have narrowed his anger. Instead, it sharpened his focus. He went back inside the barn without realizing he had moved. His rifle was still hanging where it always was, but he didn't take it, not yet. Violence wasn't the first language of this land. No matter what outsiders believed, survival came first. Reaction came second. Judgment came last, if at all. He grabbed his coat, already cold from the morning air, and stepped back outside. The world had changed in the time it took him to walk from fence to corral. Now it was pursuit. He mounted another horse quickly, the movement practiced, automatic. The saddle creaked beneath him, familiar and grounding in a way nothing else was anymore. When he pulled the reins, the animal responded instantly, as if it understood the urgency better than he did. And then he followed the trail. At first, it was easy. The storm had softened the ground just enough to hold impressions. Hoofprints led away from the ranch and toward the low ridges beyond the property line. Whoever had taken the test wasn't trying to hide the direction. That was strange. Most thieves avoided patterns. This one didn't. That detail stayed with him as he rode. The wind picked up again, carrying dust and cold air across open land. The ranch disappeared behind him, slowly, not all at once. That was how loss worked out here, not in sudden disappearance, but in gradual reduction, until distance made it feel like it had always been gone. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle, eyes fixed on the trail. There was no emotion in him yet. Not grief, not rage, not even surprise anymore. Only structure, only tracking. The part of him that still functioned properly had taken over, leaving everything else behind to be sorted out later. But somewhere underneath that control, something else was forming. A question he hadn't yet allowed himself to name, because the tracks didn't look like professional thieves. They looked like someone who knew horses, someone who didn't run from them, someone who led them. And that thought made no sense in the context of what had just happened. The trail curved slightly near a dry creek bed where rocks replaced soft soil. He slowed instinctively, reading the ground carefully now. Here, the prints became harder to follow, but not impossible. Whoever was ahead of him was still moving at a steady pace, not panicked, not rushed. That should have made him angrier. Instead, it unsettled him, because desperation didn't usually move like this. He stopped briefly at the creek's edge, scanning the far side. The land opened into scattered brush and low hills beyond. No visible movement. No sign of the horse yet. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of something he couldn't name settle in his chest. This was to just theft anymore. It was intention. And intention meant a person, not an accident, not a mistake, not weather or luck or bad timing. A person had looked at his ranch, chosen his horse, cut that latch, and walked away into the morning like they had every right to do so. He tightened his grip on the reins. For the first time since dawn, something other than control flickered inside him. Not rage, not yet recognition. Was past the acting like a criminal trying to disappear. They were acting like someone who believed they didn't have a choice. And that was the first real crack in the simple story he had built in his mind. He nudged the horse forward again. The pursuit continued. By the time he crossed the dry creek bed, the morning had fully settled into something harder than cold. It wasn't just the temperature anymore. It was the way the land felt unwelcoming, like it had already decided what kind of story this would be and refused to offer him any comfort in it. The wind moved low across the hills, brushing through sagebrush and cracked soil, carrying dust that clung to his coat and the edges of his thoughts. He had been riding long enough now that the initial shock had burned off, replaced with something quieter but more dangerous. Focus without emotion, purpose without mercy. The tracks were still there, fainter, but still honest. That was what bothered him most. Whoever had taken the horse wasn't trying to erase themselves from the land. They were hiding in panic. They were moving with intention, as if they believed the ground had no authority to judge them. And out here, that kind of belief was either foolish or justified. There was rarely anything in between. He slowed his horse as the terrain shifted. The soft soil gave way to scattered rock, then to uneven stretches of hard-packed earth where the wind had stripped away anything willing to be marked. He leaned slightly in the saddle, eyes scanning for anything the land might still be willing to give up. A broken twig, a disturbed patch of dust, a change in how shadows fell between stones. Tracking wasn't just skill out. It was listening to what the world refused to say out loud, and then he saw it. A faint turn in the trail where the hoofprints changed rhythm. Not lost, not confused, but redirected. Whoever was ahead of him had slowed, or stopped briefly. The marks showed hesitation for the first time since the pursuit began. That detail tightened something inside his chest, though he didn't acknowledge it as emotion. It was simply information, and information meant proximity. He urged the horse forward. The hills began to rise slightly now, folding into one another like old scars. A shallow valley opened ahead, and beyond it, a narrow line of trees marked a water source. It was the kind of place people used when they didn't want to be seen from a distance. Shelter without ownership. Temporary ground. He approached slowly, letting the horse pick its way down the slope. The wind dropped as he descended, and with it came a strange stillness, like the land was holding its breath. That was when he saw her again. Not fully at first, just movement near the tree line. A figure stepping in and out of shadow, guiding the horse with a hand on its reins. The animal moved calmly beside her, too calm for what had just happened. That alone should have been enough to confirm guilt. Horses didn't behave like that with strangers, unless trust had already been built. He stopped at a distance for a long moment. Neither of them moved. She didn't run. That was the second time she hadn't run. He dismounted, slowly boots pressing into dry ground that cracked slightly under his weight. The sound carried farther than it should have in the quiet. Still, she didn't react the way someone being chased would react. No sudden panic. No attempt to disappear behind trees or rock. Just a steady stillness, as if she had already accepted that this moment would arrive. When he finally stepped closer, he could see more of her. She looked worn, down in a way that wasn't just physical. Dust clung to her clothes, but it wasn't recent. It had settled in layers, like she had been moving through hard conditions for longer than a single night. Her hands were rough, not soft, in the way of someone unused to labor. And her posture, though tired, was balanced. Someone who knew how to stand her ground, even when she had nothing left to offer but endurance. The horse shifted slightly beside her, but did not resist. That detail stayed with him. "You stole my horse," he said finally. His voice sounded more controlled than he expected. Not angry, not loud, just measured. She looked at him for a moment before answering. Her eyes didn't flick away, didn't search for escape routes the way guilty people usually did when confronted. Instead, they held something closer to exhaustion than fear. "I know," she said, 2 words, no defense, no explanation. That should have made it simpler, it didn't. He studied her again, this time more carefully. The obvious conclusion would have been theft for profit people. Stole horses for money, transportation, leverage. But something didn't align. There was no urgency in her movements, now that he was here. No attempt to bargain, no attempt to manipulate. Just presence. And something about that presence felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately define. "Why?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the horse beside her, one hand resting lightly on its neck. The animal responded to her touch with a calmness that didn't belong in this situation. "I didn't take it to sell it," she said quietly. "That does to change what you did, I know." Again, no resistance, no argument. That was the problem. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away now, close enough to see the fatigue in her face more clearly, close enough to notice the subtle trembling in her fingers, not fear, but exhaustion held together by discipline. "You understand what this horse means," he said. "Yes. That doesn't make it yours. I never said it was." Silence stretched between them, thick and unsettled. In his experience, people like her fell into patterns. They lied quickly, defended themselves faster, and broke under pressure in predictable ways. But she wasn't following any of those patterns. She was answering as if the outcome had already been decided, and arguing would only waste strength she didn't have. That was new and dangerous in a different way. Behind him, the wind shifted slightly through the trees, moving leaves in a low, uneven rustle. The sound felt too ordinary for the situation, like the world was refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. He exhaled slowly. "You were coming back with me?" he said. She didn't react immediately, not resistance, not relief, just a slight lowering of her gaze, as if she had already considered that outcome long before he arrived. "Will you call the sheriff?" she asked. The question wasn't hopeful. It was practical. He didn't answer right away, because the truth was he hadn't to detend. Uh, Not because he was uncertain about, but because something about this situation didn't fit inside it cleanly. Law out here was supposed to simplify things. Right, wrong, ownership, theft. But standing here now, watching her with a horse that clearly trusted her more than it should, he felt none of that simplicity holding. "You stole a ranch horse," he said finally. "That's what happened," she agreed. The honesty should have made him angrier. Instead, it complicated everything. He moved closer to the horse, reaching out slowly. The animal tensed slightly at first, then relaxed again when she shifted her hand, as if her presence alone was enough to stabilize it. That kind of connection was something you bought or forced. It was built over time, or under necessity. You've handled horses before, he said. Yes. Not proud, not evasive, just factual. He looked back at her. You know what you took, he said. That horse is tied to a contract that keeps this ranch alive. Something flickered in her expression. Then, not guilt, not surprise, but something more complicated. Awareness, maybe. As if she understood the weight of what she had disrupted. I didn't have time, she said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. The wind picked up again, passing through the valley with a sound like distant water, moving through stone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The horse shifted its weight again. Calm between them like it belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. He should have been thinking about consequences, about returning her in immediately, about ending this before it grew more complicated than it already was. But instead, he was noticing details he didn't want to notice. The way she stood, without trying to appear stronger than she was. The way she avoided dramatic gestures, as if performance itself cost too much energy. The way the horse chose to remain, still, beside her, without resistance. None of it fit the story of theft he had started the morning with, and that made him more cautious than angry. You not from around here, he said, a pause. No, she answered. That should have been enough. But it was tea, because something about her voice carried the weight of familiarity, even in its distance, like someone who had learned how to survive places that didn't want her and had stopped expecting them to change. He studied her again, longer this time. You could run, he said. I didn't have anywhere to run to. The words landed differently than anything else she had said. Not dramatic, not emotional, just final. He tightened his jaw slightly, turning his attention back to the horse for a moment, trying to re-anchor himself in something concrete. Ownership, responsibility, facts. But facts were starting to feel less stable than they should have. You're either very brave, he said quietly, or very desperate. She met his gaze again. Those aren't different things out here. And for the first time since the morning began, he didn't have an immediate response. Because somewhere in that silence, in the space between accusation and explanation, he realized something he didn't want to admit yet. This wasn't going to be simple. Not theft, not pursuit, not law. Something had already shifted the moment he found her. And he hadn't decided yet whether that shift was danger or understanding. The ride back felt longer than the chase. Not because the distance had changed, but because everything between them had. He led the way on horseback, one hand steady on the reins, the other resting loosely near his thigh where habit, not intention, kept it ready for anything that might turn wrong. Behind him, she followed with the stolen horse now moving, as if it had never belonged anywhere else. That fact alone bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Horses remembered ownership in ways people didn't like to think about. And yet this one moved beside her with a kind of quiet acceptance that didn't match the story he had built in his mind that morning. The wind had shifted again, carrying dust across the open land in slow waves. The sky was bright now, but not warm. Light out here didn't soften anything. It only revealed what was already hard. The ranch appeared in the distance like a worn memory returning, whether he wanted it or not. Fences leaning slightly from years of repair, the barn roof dull under sun, the wide empty stretches of land that required more labor than they ever gave back. He didn't speak during the ride. Neither did she. That silence was not agreement. It wasn't comfort either. It was something more uneasy. Two people sharing the same direction without sharing the same meaning of it. When they finally passed through the main gate of the ranch, the sound of it closing behind her felt heavier than it should have. Not like an entrance. More like containment. She noticed it too. He saw the slight change in the way her shoulders adjusted. Not in fear exactly, but in awareness. Like someone stepping into a space where rules were not written for her. He dismounted first. She followed after a moment, slower, careful with her movements, as if conserving energy mattered more than appearance. The horses were guided toward the corral, and only when they were secured did the real weight of the situation settle into the space between them. He turned toward her. Now there were no hills to break the distance, no wind loud enough to distract from what had to be addressed. "You stay here until I decide what to do," he said. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't kindness either. It was procedure, the closest thing he had left to certainty. She nodded once, no argument, no resistance. That, again, unsettled him more than defiance would have. He expected questions. He expected negotiation. He expected fear. But what he kept receiving instead was compliance shaped like exhaustion, as if she had already spent all her resistance somewhere before she ever arrived here. He motioned toward the barn. "You'll sleep there. We'll talk tomorrow." Another nod. Still nothing more. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary, trying to find something in her reaction that would confirm what he believed he was dealing with. A thief. A mistake. A problem that could be solved with enough structure and consequence. But she didn't behave like a problem. She behaved like someone used to being placed where other people decided. That thought stayed with him longer than he liked. The rest of the day returned to work because work was the only language the ranch understood when uncertainty entered it. He fixed the broken fence line he had started that morning, though now every motion felt slightly displaced, as if part of his attention had been left behind in the corral. The land demanded physical correction, not emotional analysis. Boards had to be replaced, wire had to be tightened, animals had to be checked. Life here didn't pause for moral confusion, but he noticed things he normally wouldn't. How the wind moved differently near the east pasture, where the grass grew thinner. How the barn door stuck slightly more than it used to. How the horses shifted their weight when they sensed unfamiliar presence nearby. And how, every time he passed the corral, his eyes instinctively moved toward the stolen horse and the woman standing near it. She didn't try to hide. She didn't try to take space either. She simply existed within it, as if she were trying to learn the boundaries of a place she had no permission to assume she belonged to. At one point, he saw her adjusting the water trough. Not dramatically, not as if she were trying to prove anything. Just practical correction, lifting, angling, ensuring flow. The horse beside her remained calm. Too calm. He had seen trained horses. He had seen bonded horses. But this was something in between those categories, something that didn't fit easily into his understanding of how trust was supposed to be built. He stopped working for a moment without meaning to, watched, then forced himself to continue. By late afternoon, heat had started to rise from the ground, turning the air into something heavier, slower. The ranch always felt different at this hour. Less like survival, more like endurance. Shadows stretched across the yard, long and uncertain. The sound of distant cattle carried faintly across the land, a reminder that life continued even when individual situations became complicated. He found her near the barn again when he went to check supplies. She was sitting, not fully resting, but not working either. A position that suggested her body had finally demanded a pause she had stopped arguing against. The stolen horse stood nearby, loosely tied but not distressed. That detail still didn't make sense to him. Horses didn't simply accept unfamiliar people unless something deeper had already been established. He leaned against the barn post, not announcing his presence immediately. For a moment, he simply observed the way she kept her gaze low, but not submissive, the way her hands rested on her knees, not shaking, but clearly worn, the way her breathing carried the rhythm of someone who had been pushing through too many nights without enough rest. "You are not afraid," he said finally. She didn't look up right away. "I am," she answered. The honesty surprised him again. It shouldn't, but it did. "Then you hide it well," he said. "I don't have energy to do anything else." That answer landed differently than he expected. Not as defense, not as strategy, as truth. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "You still haven't told me why you took the horse," he said. A pause. "I told you," she replied. "I didn't have time. Not enough was enough for me." Silence again. Silent, heavy silence. The kind that carried too many unspoken symptoms underneath. He looked toward the barnyard then, and he said, "Doesn't always feel fair." She nodded slightly. "I know, and you broke it." Another nod. No denial. No correction. That should have made everything clearer. Instead, it made it more complicated, because people who lie often try to soften consequences. People who resist try to reshape outcomes. But she wasn't doing either. She was accepting the framework entirely while refusing to explain the reason she had stepped outside it. That didn't fit into his understanding of wrongdoing, or justice, or desperation. Later, he found himself watching her again from a distance while checking the barn equipment. The day was starting to cool, the light shifting toward evening. Long shadows made everything look slightly older than it was. The ranch felt like it always did at this hour. Quiet, but not peaceful. Quiet, in the way things are quiet before decisions are made. She had begun cleaning the horse tack, carefully, methodically, not like someone trying to earn trust, like someone trying not to waste anything. The horse leaned slightly toward her while she worked, and that detail, small, almost invisible, hit him harder than anything else that day. Horses didn't lean toward strangers unless something had already been established that bypassed logic. Trust wasn't supposed to happen this quickly, or this quietly. He stepped into the open slowly. She noticed him, but did a stop. "You worked with horses before," he said. "Yes." Where a pause. Different places. Not a lie, not truth either. Just boundary. He should have pressed further, but something in her tone made him stop instead, because there was a difference between secrecy and refusal. Secrecy invites pursuit. Refusal ends it. He leaned against the fence nearby, watching her work. "You know what you did has consequences," he said. "I know," she replied. "And you still did it." Another pause. Yes. That answer should have made him angrier. Instead, it made him quieter. Because beneath everything, theft, the legal implications, the broken trust, there was something he had yet been able to name properly. A logic that didn't belong to his world. A survival system that operated outside the rules he had spent his entire life relying on. And worse than that, it worked. Not morally, not legally, but practically. It worked. And that meant everything he thought he understood about control, ownership, and right and wrong was less stable, than it had been yesterday. The sun dipped lower, turning the dust in the air into faint gold. He finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Out here," he said, "everything costs something." She didn't look up. "Not everything can be paid for," she said. And for the first time, since he had found the empty corral that morning, he didn't have a response that felt like certainty. Only the growing awareness that whatever this was becoming, it wasn't staying inside the boundaries of law anymore. It was becoming something older than that, something harder to define, and far more difficult to control. The next morning arrived without asking permission. That was the first thing he noticed when he stepped out of the house. The land didn't look different, but it felt different, like something unseen had shifted its weight during the night. The air was colder than expected for early light, and the wind carried a dryness that made every breath feel slightly sharper than it should have. He stood on the porch for a moment longer than usual, not because he was resting, but because habit demanded confirmation that nothing had changed while he wasn't watching. But something had. It always did, eventually. He walked toward the barn first. The routine was the same as every morning. Check the animals, inspect the fence line, make sure nothing had broken during the night. But now there was an additional variable moving through the structure of his day, something human, unpredictable, and not fully contained by any rule he trusted. She was already awake. He saw her before she saw him. Inside the barn, she was working quietly near the saddles, not touching anything that didn't require attention. The stolen horse stood nearby, calm as always, as if the idea of ownership had never been part of its vocabulary. There was something unsettling about that calmness now, something that no longer felt accidental. It felt like agreement. She didn't look up immediately when he entered. That alone told him she was already used to the space, or already resigned to it. "You didn't sleep long," he said. Her hands paused briefly on the leather strap she was adjusting. "Enough?" It wasn't an answer meant to invite concern, just information. He stepped further inside, letting the barn door swing lightly behind him. The sound echoed more than it should have. "We're not done talking," he said. "I know." Still, no resistance. Still, no attempt to reframe her situation. That was becoming the pattern he couldn't quite decide how to interpret. He watched her for a moment longer. The way she moved was careful but efficient, like someone who understood that wasted motion was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was trying to prove usefulness. She was simply operating within it. "Where are you from?" he asked, a pause. "Does it matter?" she replied. It was T to defiance. It was a boundary drawn without aggression. He exhaled slowly through his nose, leaning slightly against a post. "It matters if you're going to stay on my land." "I'm not staying," she said. The words came too quickly to be rehearsed. That was the first crack in her consistency he had seen. He studied her more closely now. "You were working here," he said. "I'm returning what I took. That's not the same as leaving." She didn't respond immediately. Outside, a horse shifted its weight, the sound of hooves dull against packed dirt. Somewhere farther off, a windmill creaked as it turned slowly in the breeze. The ranch kept moving, regardless of their conversation. Then she said quietly, "I want to be here long." He believed her, and that bothered him more than if she had lied. It was late morning when the first sign of outside trouble arrived. A truck he didn't recognize came down the dirt road slowly, raising a thin trail of dust behind it. The sound of it carried across the land before it was fully visible, a mechanical intrusion into a place that usually measured time by wind and animal movement rather than engines. He saw it from the fence line first. He didn't move immediately. Instead, he watched vehicles like that did come out here unless something had shifted in a way that required witnessing. The truck stopped near the main gate. Two men stepped out, not ranch workers, not neighbors, something else. He recognized one of them after a moment, the local land broker, who had been circling his property for months like a patient predator. The other man looked younger, carrying a folder too tightly, like it contained something more important than paper. The ranch suddenly felt smaller. Or maybe it was just his attention narrowing. He started walking toward them before they reached the porch. Behind him, he was aware, without turning, that she had stopped working. That detail mattered, but not enough to change direction. "Didn't expect you to be here this early," the broker said as he approached. The tone was casual, but nothing about his presence was. "You re-trespassing?" the protagonist replied. The broker smiled slightly. "Technically, we re-on the access road. State your business." The younger man opened the folder slightly, then closed it again, as if unsure when to begin. That hesitation was new. "The broker didn't hesitate. "We hear about your mortgage extension," he said. There it was, not unexpected, but still heavier in person than on paper. The word extension always meant the same thing out here: delay before loss. "I already responded to the bank," he said. "Yeah," the broker replied, "and they not satisfied with your timeline." The wind moved through the fence line behind them, rattling loose wire. He didn't look away from the men. "What's the new condition?" he asked. The broker shifted his weight slightly, glancing around the property as if assessing its value in real time. "They want collateral assurance. Livestock count confirmed. Assets verified." And he paused slightly. "A formal inspection of all registered animals." His jaw tightened slightly. That meant the horse. Not just any horse. That horse. And suddenly, the timing of everything aligned in a way he didn't like. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see movement near the barn. She had stepped out. Not hiding, not approaching, just standing at a distance where she could see but not be immediately seen as part of the conversation. The broker noticed her too. His expression changed subtly. Recognition, interest, or calculation. "You've got someone new working here?" the broker asked. "No," he said immediately, but the answer came too late. The younger man had already looked down at his notes. "Does she have documentation?" the younger man asked. Silence, not long, but heavy enough to shift the direction of the moment. "She's not part of this conversation," the protagonist said. The broker smiled again, smaller this time. "Everything on the property is part of the conversation when the bank is involved." Was the truth no one out here liked admitting. Ownership was never fully private when debt existed. Behind him, he felt her presence remain still, not retreating, not stepping forward, just existing in the space that was now suddenly under scrutiny. And that was when he realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't just a person in his barn anymore. She was now a variable in his financial collapse. After they left, the ranch felt quieter in a different way. Not peaceful, exposed. He stood near the fence for a long time, after the truck disappeared, watching the dust settle back into the ground as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something had been officiously noticed now. That was how pressure worked out here. It didn't start loud, it started recognized. He didn't hear her approach, but he felt it. "You should have told me," she said. He didn't turn immediately. "There wasn't anything to tell," he replied. "That man looked at me like I was a problem." "You are," he said, then corrected himself slightly. To them, a pause. "That's not what I meant," she said. Now he turned. She stood a few feet away, arms loosely at her sides, not defensive, but not open either. "They re going to inspect the livestock?" he said. Her eyes shifted slightly, and for the first time since he had met her, something resembling tension appeared, not fear exactly, but calculation. "That horse is going to be seen?" she said. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, she looked less certain, not of herself, but of what came next. "You can hide it," she said quietly. "I'm not hiding it," he replied. That wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. Later that afternoon, the ranch became a place of quiet preparation, rather than routine work. He moved through tasks mechanically, but his attention was divided now. Inspection meant exposure. Exposure meant consequences. And consequences meant decisions he had been forced to make. She continued, but working. Differently now, less steady, more aware. At one point, he saw her standing near the horse longer than usual, her hand resting lightly on its neck. Not claiming, not controlling, just steadying something that might not stay steady much longer. He didn't interrupt her, but he noticed the change, the outside world, and finally reached them, and it was he interested in understanding context. Only ownership, only classification, only proof. And for the first time since the chase began, he understood something clearly. Whatever was forming between them, whatever complicated truth was beginning to take shape, it was about to be tested by a system that didn't care whether it made sense, only whether it was legal, and whether it could be taken away with it. The storm didn't announce itself the way people expected storms to announce anything out here. There was no sudden break in the sky, no dramatic shift that signaled change was coming. It began instead as a slow thickening of the air, as if the land itself had started holding its breath a little too long. The wind, which had been steady all afternoon, softened and then hesitated, unsure of its own direction. Even the animals seemed to sense it first. Horses stopped shifting restlessly in their pens. The usual background sounds of the ranch, the creak of wood, the distant call of birds, the low movement of cattle, began to thin out, one by one, until what remained felt unnaturally precise. He noticed it while checking the western fence line. The sky had turned the color of old steel without fully darkening. That kind of sky meant distance, not necessarily danger yet, but the kind of weather that didn't respect preparation. He tightened a section of wire out of habit, though he knew would no matter much if the storm came in hard. Out here, effort was not always protection. Sometimes it was just ritual. By the time he returned toward the barn, the first drop of rain had already fallen. It landed on the dry ground with a sound so faint it almost didn't exist, then another, then a pause. Then the land began to remember water. He stopped under the edge of the barn roof, watching the horizon shift. The rain wasn't heavy yet, but it was committed. That was the difference out here. Light rain could be ignored, committed rain could not. Inside the barn, she was already moving. He didn't see her at first, only the horse shifting slightly, sensing change. Then her silhouette appeared near the tack area, arms working carefully as she secured straps and moved equipment out of the way of potential dampness. She wasn't rushing. That was the first thing he noticed. She never rushed unless something demanded it. Instead, she prepared. Preparation, he realized, was something she understood differently than most people he had worked with. He stepped inside without speaking. The barn smelled stronger now that the air was wet hay, leather, wood, and animal warmth mixing into something dense and familiar. It was a smell that usually meant stability. Today, it felt more like containment. She glanced at him briefly when he entered, then returned to her work. "You knew the storm was coming," he said. "I felt it," she replied. That answer should have sounded vague. It didn't. It sounded practiced. He watched her for a moment longer. "You still not telling me where you learned this?" She paused slightly, hand still on the tack. "It doesn't matter where I learned it. It matters here." A small silence followed, not tense, not calm, just full. Then she said, "Not everything has a story you can place." That line stayed with him longer than it should have. Outside, rain began to increase. Slowly at first, then with more certainty. The barn doors shifted slightly under the pressure of wind. Creaking in protest, he moved to secure them, checking latches, making sure nothing would come loose if the storm strengthened. It was the kind of task that required attention, but not thought, perfect for moments when thinking was not useful. When he turned back, she had moved closer to the horse, not invading space, not retreating from it either, just existing in it in a way that felt increasingly natural. The horse lowered its head slightly as she adjusted the reins. Not submission, not fear, something closer to recognition. That detail should have bothered him more than it did. Instead, it only deepened a question he had been avoiding since the moment he first saw her. How long had she been doing this kind of work? And where? Thunder rolled far off, low and distant, like something large shifting its weight behind the horizon. She spoke without looking at him. "You should close the side vents. I already checked them. They'll still pull water if the wind turns." He hesitated, then went to check them anyway. That was becoming another pattern he hadn't fully named yet. Not obedience, not agreement, something more uncomfortable. Trust built through correction. By the time the rain fully arrived, the barn had become a different world. The sound changed everything. Rain on wood, rain on metal, rain collecting in uneven rhythms across surfaces that had never been designed for silence. The outside world became less visible, replaced by sound that filled every gap between thought and action. They were trapped inside it now, whether they liked it or not. Not physically trapped, but functionally isolated. He leaned against a support beam for a moment, watching her move through the barn with quiet efficiency. The horse stood calmer than most animals did during storms. That alone would have been enough to raise questions under normal circumstances. But nothing about her presence felt normal anymore. The ranch, which usually felt like a place defined by control and routine, now felt like something else entirely. Smaller, closer, more personal than he was comfortable admitting. At some point, exhaustion made its way into the room without announcing itself. Not his exhaustion alone, the kind that comes from sustained tension without resolution. She eventually stopped moving as much too, resting briefly near the tack table, one hand still lightly touching the edge as if keeping herself anchored. The rain outside grew heavier, and then something changed inside her. It wasn't that dramatic. It wasn't visible at first. It was the way her breathing shifted slightly, the way her hand tightened, then loosened again, the way her focus drifted not away from the barn, but inward. He noticed it immediately. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. That alone told him something was wrong. She turned her head slightly, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she said quietly, "Yes, not doing well." He frowned slightly. "Who?" A pause. "The reason I took the horse," she said. That was the first time she had acknowledged it directly. Not the act, not the consequences, but the reason behind it. He stepped closer without realizing it. "What do you mean, not doing well?" Her eyes stayed on the rain outside the barn opening. Time is running out. That wasn't explanation. That was fracture. He felt something shift in his understanding, not clarity, but disruption. You stole a horse, he said slowly. Because someone is sick? She corrected him quietly. Because someone is dying. The word landed heavier than anything else that day. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer now. Inside, the barn felt smaller. Not physically, morally, he exhaled slowly through his nose, turning away for a moment as if distance could reorganize his thoughts into something manageable. But it didn't he? The facts didn't align neatly anymore. Theft had a shape. Survival had a shape. But this fell somewhere between them in a way that refused classification. You should have told me, he said finally. I did, she replied. He turned back. You didn't explain. I didn't have time to explain that phrase again. Not an excuse, a boundary. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, thinking. So the horse was the only way, she finished. Silence returned. But it was different now. He looked at her more carefully than before. Not as a suspect, not as a worker, not even as a problem. As a person carrying something that had weight beyond the ranch. Why this horse? He asked. A pause. Then she said, because it can travel farther than anything else available to me when I needed it. And you decided that meant taking it from me. I didn't decide lightly, she said. That was the closest thing to emotion she had shown. Not guilt, not defense. Weight. Outside, the rain hit harder. Inside, everything felt closer. He walked a few steps away, trying to process the shape of what she had just revealed. Not just the act, but the reasoning behind it. It didn't excuse anything, but it changed the geometry of blame in a way he didn't like. Because blame was supposed to be simple. This wasn't simple. This was layered, human. Complicated in a way that law didn't like to admit. The storm reached its peak without warning. One moment, it was heavy rain. The next, it was pressure wind forcing itself against the structure of the barn, testing it like something impatient. Wood creaked. Metal groaned. The horse shifted once, then settled again as if deciding that fear was unnecessary. He moved instinctively, checking structural points, securing what could be secured. She did the same without being told. Their movements didn't coordinate, but they didn't conflict either. It was something closer to parallel thinking than cooperation. At one point, their hands reached the same loose latch at the same time. They paused, looked at each other briefly. Then she stepped back first. He tightened it himself. Neither commented. But the moment remained, not emotional, not dramatic, just acknowledged. Outside, wind slammed against the barn again, harder this time. A distant sound suggested something had shifted in the fence line beyond view, but neither of them could go check. Not now, so they stayed inside, listening to the world press against them without permission. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook structure. He lowered himself onto a support crate, elbows resting on his knees, eyes briefly closed, not sleeping, just pausing. When he opened them again, she was still there. Not closer, not farther, just present. The horse exhaled slowly nearby, a sound like acceptance. He spoke quietly. If what you re-saying is true, she waited. He continued, then you didn't steal the horse for profit. No, she said, but you still took it. Yes, no escape in her answer. Only fact. He nodded slowly, as if that helped him organize the contradiction. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, nothing resolved. But something had shifted again, not toward clarity, toward understanding that clarity might not be the point at all. And for the first time since the chase began, he realized the problem was no longer what she had done. It was what he would do, now that he understood why. Morning after the storm did not arrive like relief. It arrived like exposure. The sky was washed clean in the way only violent weather could manage, too clear, too bright, as if the land had been forced to confess everything It was trying to hide the night before. Water still clung to the edges of the barn roof, dripping at uneven intervals that sounded louder than they should have. The ground outside had darkened into heavy soil again, marked with shallow puddles that reflected a sky too calm to trust. He stood near the doorway for a moment before stepping out, not because he was uncertain about work, because something inside the structure of his thinking had shifted overnight, and he hadn't yet decided what parts of himself were still usable in the same way. Inside the barn, she was already awake. Of course, she was. That detail was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like pattern. She didn't move like someone who waited for permission from the day. She moved like someone who assumed the day would not wait for her. The horse stood near her, calm as always. Too calm, that same unsettling calm that refused to behave according to expectation. She didn't look up immediately when he entered. That was new too. Not avoidance, just continuity. As if yesterday had not broken anything open between them that required repair. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I did," she replied. It was the simplest contradiction she ever offered, and somehow the most honest. He stepped further into the barn, boots quiet against damp wood. The smell of wet hay still lingered, mixed with leather and earth that hadn't fully dried. The storm had changed the building in small ways, warping a few boards, shifting the way light entered through gaps, but nothing was broken. Structurally, everything held. It was always like that, he thought. The land could survive almost anything. People were less reliable. "You said someone is dying," he said. She paused for a moment, tightening a strap on the saddle before answering. "Yes." "Who?" Another pause. Longer this time. That hesitation mattered more than refusal. "Someone I owe," she said finally. "That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters." He studied her carefully now. Not as a suspect, not as an employee, not even as someone temporary in his space. Something about the storm had shifted the way he was seeing her. The edges of accusation had softened, not into forgiveness, but into something more dangerous. Comprehension. Understanding always came with cost. He had learned that. He just hadn't expected it here. "You stole my horse," he said again. "Slower this time because someone is dying." "Yes, and you believe that justifies it. I believe it made it necessary." The word necessary lingered between them. Not defense, not apology. Structure. He exhaled slowly, turning his gaze toward the stall where the horse stood. The animal flicked its ears once, then settled again, as if it had already accepted all interpretations of its existence. "There are other ways," he said. "Not where I come from," she replied. That line hit differently than the others. Not because it was emotional, because it was final. He turned back to her. "Where do you come from?" She didn't answer immediately, and this time he didn't push, because something about her expression had changed slightly. Not fear, not resistance, but distance. As if asking further would not reveal more truth, but risk breaking something that was already barely holding together instead. She said quietly, "You would understand it as a place should have sounded evasive." But it didn't. It sounded lived. The rest of the morning unfolded in fragments of routine that no longer felt entirely connected to each other. He checked fences. She tended to equipment. The horse shifted between them like a silent witness to something neither of them had agreed to name yet. But everything they did now carried a second layer, meaning underneath function, weight underneath action. At one point, he caught himself watching her longer than necessary while she worked near the tax station. Not evaluating, not judging, just observing patterns he hadn't fully mapped yet. the way she adjusted things without asking, the way she corrected small inefficiencies without commentary, the way she never treated the space like it belonged fully to her, but also never treated herself like she didn't belong in it at all. That balance was unfamiliar. Most people he had worked with out here fell into one of two categories. They either tried to own the space too quickly, or they never settled into it at all. She did neither. She adapted without claiming, existed without shrinking, and that, he was starting to realize, was not something you learned casually. By midday, the sun had returned fully, and with it came the sound of distant activity beyond the ranch boundary. Not close enough to see yet, but close enough to feel in the way the land subtly prepared itself for external observation. He noticed it before he saw it, the same truck, or one like it, approaching again, this time slower, more deliberate. He felt tension rise in his shoulders before he consciously identified why. The inspection. He had known it was coming, but knowing and experiencing were never the same thing out here. He walked toward the main gate without signaling. She noticed him moving and followed at a distance, not asking questions, not hesitating. The horse remained behind in the barn, but its absence felt temporary, like something still part of the conversation, even when not visible. The truck stopped exactly where it had the day before. The same two men stepped out. The broker looked more satisfied this time. That was never a good sign. "Morning," he said casually. The protagonist didn't respond. The younger man opened the folder immediately this time, no hesitation. "We re-here for the livestock verification," he said. Do it quickly," the protagonist replied. The broker smiled slightly. "We will." That smile carried intention, not friendliness. "Assessment. The kind of attention that does look at people unless they are part of a calculation." And then the younger man spoke again. "There's an additional requirement." The protagonist didn't move. "What requirement?" The broker glanced toward the barn. That was when everything shifted. "She's listed as an unregistered occupant," the broker said. Silence, not dramatic, immediate, sharp. Behind him, he felt her presence still, not retreating, not stepping forward, just still. The younger man continued reading. "Any unidentified personnel on mortgaged property must be documented or removed pending inspection." The word "removed" was what changed the air. Not loud, not emotional, but final. The protagonist's jaw tightened slightly. "She is not part of this," he said. The broker shrugged, then "Document her." "You're using her to pressure the inspection," he said quietly. The broker didn't deny it. That was answer enough. Behind him, he heard her shift slightly, not fear, calculation, that same internal adjustment he had seen before. And suddenly, he understood something he hadn't wanted to. She was just a person in this situation anymore. She had become leverage, whether intentionally or not. That was how systems worked out here. They didn't care about origin, only utility. After they left again, the silence felt heavier than the storm had been. The ranch no longer felt private. It felt observed. He stood to the fence for a long time, not moving, not speaking, watching dust settle in patterns that no longer meant peace. She approached slowly. "You should have told me," she said. He didn't look at her immediately. "It wouldn't have changed anything. It changes how I stand here." That made him turn. Her expression was controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. Not panic, not regret. Something closer to awareness of consequence extending beyond herself. "They're going to keep using me," she said quietly. "Not if I remove you from the equation," he replied. That sentence hung between them. He didn't mean it harshly, but it still landed that way. She looked at him more directly now. "Is That what I am to you? An equation? A pause. No, he said. That S what they make everything into. That answer surprised even him, because it was more honest than he had intended. Later, he found her near the barn again. Not working, just standing, the horse beside her, the wind moving lightly across the yard, carrying dust and light in equal measure. You said someone is dying, he said quietly.
Yes.
And the horse was your only option. Yes, he nodded slowly. Then, after a long pause, if I had known that yesterday, he stopped, because he didn't know how to finish that sentence without lying. She waited, but he didn't continue. Instead, he said something else, something that surprised both of them. Understanding you doesn't make this simpler, he said. No, she replied softly. It just makes it real. And for the first time since the chase began, neither of them had anything left to hide behind that could make the situations feel clean. He noticed it first in the way the horse reacted to the wind. Not fear, not agitation, something closer to recognition. The animal lifted its head slightly when the breeze moved across the yard, as if it were hearing something the human world could not translate. That detail should not have mattered as much as it did, but by now, small details were beginning to carry disproportionate weight in his mind. Out here, truth rarely announced itself directly. It arrived sideways, disguised as behavior, timing, or instinct. The morning was clear again, but not clean. The storm had passed, yet the land still bore its residue-darkened soil, softened edges, and that strange quiet that followed anything powerful enough to reshape the air. He stood near the fence line longer than usual, not because there was work to avoid, but because movement felt slightly delayed, as if every decision required more internal negotiation than before. Behind him, she was already working. That was becoming another pattern he couldn't ignore. She did not wait for instruction. She did not ask for confirmation. She simply observed what needed doing and moved toward it, as if responsibility was not something granted, but something assumed. Today, she was repairing a section of tack that had loosened during the storm. The horse stood nearby, calm as always, watching her with an attention that felt almost inconvenient in its consistency. He should have been focused on the inspection risk, on the broker, on the mortgage pressure tightening its grip around the ranch. But instead, his attention kept returning to her, not because she demanded it, because she didn't tea, and that was harder to interpret than anything else. He walked toward the barn slowly, boots pressing into damp ground that still hadn't fully recovered by it from yesterday, this weather. When he entered, she didn't turn immediately. Only after finishing a small adjustment did she acknowledge his presence with a glance. You've been quiet, she said. It's not unusual, he replied. It is since yesterday. That was true enough that he didn't correct it. He leaned against a wooden post, watching her work. The inspection isn't going away. I know, she said. And they were still looking at you as a liability. I know that too. Her responses were steady, not defensive, not emotional, just present. He studied her more carefully now. You're not reacting like someone who's afraid of being exposed. A pause. I've been exposed before, she said. That sentence should have opened a door. Instead, it closed one. Because she didn't elaborate, and somehow that silence carried more weight than explanation would have. He stepped closer without realizing it. Where did you learn to handle horses like this? This time, she hesitated. Longer, not avoidance, measurement. As if deciding what version of truth could exist safely in this space. Different places, she said finally. That S not an answer, he replied. It S the only one that fits. That phrase again, he was beginning to recognize it now, not as evasion, but as boundary. She did not lie often. When she withheld, it was due to deceive, was to contain, and containment out here usually meant pain behind it. Before he could press further, the sound of movement outside interrupted them. Not the wind, not the animals. A vehicle. He felt it before he saw it. That familiar intrusion of mechanical sound into a world that did not naturally belong to machinery. The same truck returned, again, but this time slower, more deliberate, as if the purpose of the visit had evolved beyond inspection into something more personal. He stepped out first, motioning for her to stay back without turning fully to confirm she would obey. She did not argue, but she also did not retreat far. That balance between compliance and autonomy was becoming another pattern he couldn't fully categorize. The truck stopped. The broker stepped out first, but this time he was alone. There was another man, older, dressedly, not a land agent, not a worker, something closer to institutional authority. The kind that didn't negotiate directly, it evaluated outcomes. The younger assistant opened the folder again, but the older man didn't look at paperwork immediately. His attention went straight to the ranch, then to her, and something subtle changed in his expression. Recognition, not casual, not uncertain, familiar. The protagonist noticed it immediately. "What is this?" he asked sharply. The broker smiled faintly, but it was dissatisfaction this time. It was anticipation. "We re-clarifying ownership disputes." "There are no ownership disputes," the protagonist replied. The older man finally spoke, voice calm, controlled. "That depends on documentation." Silence fell across the yard. The wind shifted slightly, moving dust in slow arcs that made everything feel temporarily suspended. The assistant flipped a page in the folder. "She is listed under a prior record," he said. The protagonist turned slightly. That detail had not existed yesterday, or if it had not been visible. "What record?" he asked. The older man finally looked at her directly, and now the silence changed shape, not tension. Recognition deepened. She was registered under a prior employment and residence file, the assistant continued. "Attached to livestock transport licensing in the eastern counties." That should have been a bureaucratic noise. But it wasn't tea, because the way the older man was looking at her suggested this was not the first time he had seen her. "You've been here before," the protagonist said quietly, turning toward her. She didn't respond immediately. That pause, again, that careful internal calculation, not containment. "Yes," she said finally. The word landed harder than any accusation. Behind him, something in his understanding shifted. "Not collapse." "Rearrangement. You never said that," he said. "You didn't ask," she replied. That was technically true, but it didn't feel complete. The older man stepped slightly forward. "You left under unresolved conditions." Still speaking to her now, not him. That alone changed the structure of the moment. "What conditions?" the protagonist asked sharply. The broker exhaled slightly. That S complicated. "That S becoming a pattern," the protagonist said. No one responded to that. The assistant checked another page. "There is also a financial discrepancy tied to livestock asset movement during that period." That sentence did something subtle to the air, because now the horse was no longer just a stolen object. It was part of a system that predated this ranch entirely, and she was not a stranger to that system. She stood still, not defensive, not apologetic, just present under history that had finally caught up with her. The protagonist turned toward her fully now. "You came here knowing this would happen," he said quietly. "No," she replied, another pause, then more carefully. "Came here because I didn't have another place left where I could finish what I started. That was not explanation. That was pressure against a locked door. The older man observed her for a moment longer. You should return the asset immediately. The horse shifted slightly at the word asset. The protagonist noticed that too, because now even the animal had been absorbed into classification. No, he said immediately. All eyes turned to him, including hers. That was the first time she looked surprised, not at defiance, at commitment. This is my property, he continued. The broker shook his head slightly. It's under review. I didn't ask for review. That is not how law works out here, the assistant said quietly. The protagonist stepped forward slightly. Out here? Law doesn't survive without people willing to interpret it. That line hung in the air longer than expected. The older man finally spoke again, softer this time. You don't understand what you are protecting. The protagonist didn't look away, then explain it. But the older man didn't answer him. Instead, he looked at her again and said something that changed everything without raising his voice. You left because of the last transfer failure. Silence, absolute. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. The protagonist turned slowly toward her. Not anger yet. Not betrayal. Something more unstable. Understanding trying to form before it had enough structure. What does that mean? He asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. That was the first time her composure cracked, not visibly, not emotionally, but structurally. Like something inside her system of control had reached its limit. I didn't fail, she said finally. The older man corrected her gently. The outcome did not meet legal requirements. That distinction mattered. Too much. The protagonist looked between them, then back at her. And slowly the realization began forming not all at once, but in pieces that refused to align comfortably. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't just survival. This was continuity. History looping back into the present. You didn't come here randomly, he said quietly. She didn't deny it. That was answer enough. The horse shifted again, uneasy now. Not from weather, from human tension. The protagonist stepped back slightly, as if distance could stabilize interpretation. You used me, he said. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. She finally looked at him directly now, and for the first time her voice wasn't fully steady. I didn't come here for you, she said. That should have softened it. It didn't, because it clarified something worse. He was, the center of the story. He was part of its mechanism. Silence returned again, but now it was different, because nothing inside it was uncertain anymore, only unfinished. And for the first time since the chase began, he understood clearly. The past had not been behind them at all. It had been walking toward them the entire time. The morning after they came, the ranch didn't feel like it belonged to him anymore. It still looked the same on the surface fences, leaning in familiar places, the barn standing, where it had always stood, the long stretches of dry land, breathing under a sky that pretended nothing had changed. But he knew better now. Change out here rarely announced itself with destruction. It arrived quietly, through attention, through documentation, through people who stopped asking what things felt like and started deciding what they officially were. He stood near to the corral for a long time before stepping inside. The horse was there, still calm, still impossibly steady. That steadiness used to feel reassuring. Now it felt like a question. He couldn't answer. She was already inside the barn. Of course she was. She had stopped behaving like a guest days ago. Not because she claimed ownership, but because she never acted like she needed permission to exist in space that already existed. She didn't look up immediately when he entered. That was becoming its own kind of language between them. Silence used not as avoidance, but as restraint. You heard what they said, he finally said. I heard, she replied. No hesitation, no denial, just acknowledgement. He stepped closer, stopping near a wooden post that had been repaired too many times to still be considered stable. They were going to take this further. They already have, she said. That was the problem. She always answered like the future was already decided. He exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the rough wood beside him. They think the horse is evidence. It is, she said quietly. That sentence landed differently than the others, because she didn't argue against it. She accepted it, and acceptance in her case, didn't feel like surrender. It felt like preparation. He turned toward her fully now. You're not telling me everything, he said. A pause. Not defensive. Not guilty. Measured. I told you enough for this to happen, she replied. That it's not the same thing. No, she agreed softly. It isn't tea. Silence settled again. Outside, the wind shifted dust across the yard in slow, indifferent waves. He had spent most of his life believing that clarity came from accumulation of facts. The more pieces you had, the more stable the picture became. But now he was starting to understand something he didn't. Sometimes more information didn't create clarity. It created fracture. You said you came here to finish something, he said. Yes, and you used my horse to do it. I used what was available, she corrected gently. That distinction mattered. Too much. He stepped away from the post, moving a few paces without direction. Do you understand what this means for me? A pause. Yes, she said again, but this time it sounded different. Not detached, not neutral, aware. That was new. He stopped walking, turned back then. Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? He asked. Her eyes stayed steady on him now, not challenging, not avoiding, because the answer, whatever it was no longer theoretical. I didn't think you would believe me, she said. There it was, the first crack that wasn't about law or survival or consequence. It was about trust, or the lack of it. He didn't respond immediately, because part of him wanted to say that she was wrong. But another part of him, albeit inconvenient and increasingly difficult to ignore, was no longer certain. The day moved forward without permission. Work still existed. It always did. Fences still needed repair. Animals still needed care. The land still required maintenance that didn't care about legal disputes or emotional complexity. That was the one comfort left. The ranch did not stop functioning simply because the meaning of ownership had become uncertain. He worked through the motions out of necessity, more than focus. She worked too, but differently now. There was less certainty in her movements, not fear. Adjustment, like someone recalibrating under pressure that had finally become visible. At one point, he saw her stop near the horse for longer than usual, not touching it immediately, just standing beside it, listening, not to sound, to something else, something internal. He watched her without interrupting, and for the first time, he noticed something he had missed before. She wasn't T-bonding with the horse. She was checking it as if it was part of a system she needed to verify. That thought made something uncomfortable settle in his chest, because systems didn't belong to emotional survival. They belonged to structure, to planning, to intent. By late afternoon, the silence changed again. A vehicle approached. Not the broker this time. Different sound, different weight. He felt it before he saw it. A second truck stopped near the gate. This one carried no negotiation energy, only finality. Tukin stepped out, and one of them immediately opened a sealed folder. No introduction, no courtesy, only procedure. We've been authorized to proceed with asset recovery, the lead officer said. The words were clean,
professional,
attached, and completely irreversible. The protagonist didn't move immediately. On what basis? He asked. The officer glanced at the folder. Unresolved livestock dispute involving transported property. The horse shifted slightly in the corral behind, sensing tense tension, even if it didn't understand it. Behind him, he felt her presence go still, not afraid, focused. That difference mattered more than it should have. The officer continued. The animal will be transferred, pending final legal determination. No, the protagonist said immediately. The officer looked at him. This is not optional. That sentence changed the air. Not loudly, but completely. The protagonist stepped forward slightly. You're not taking it. The second officer adjusted his stance. The first officer didn't because people who had done this enough didn't react to resistance emotionally, only logistically. You are obstructing enforcement, the officer said. I am correcting it, he replied. That distinction meant nothing to them, but everything to him. Behind him, she finally stepped forward, not rushing, not hiding, just moving into visibility. That alone shifted the officer's attention. This is her? The second officer asked. Silence. Then the protagonist answered before she could. Yes, she looked at him briefly, not surprised. But something in her expression softened slightly. Because he hadn't denied her, the officer flipped a page. You are listed as an involved party in prior livestock transport discrepancy. She didn't respond, immediately then quietly. I know, that calm acceptance again. The kind that made legal systems uncomfortable because it removed the resistance they depended on. The officer continued, You will need to accompany us for formal review. The protagonist stepped forward immediately. No, the officer looked at him again. This is not your decision. The protagonist held his ground. Everything on this land is my responsibility. A pause. The officer said something that changed everything again. Not anymore. Silence. Even the wind seemed to reduce itself. The protagonist felt it before he fully understood it. The shift. The transfer of authority. Not emotional. Legal. The kind that didn't care about effort, history, or intention. Only documentation. The officer held up the folder slightly. This property is under conditional reassessment. He turned slightly toward the broker, who had appeared near the gate without being noticed. That confirmed it. Coordination. The system had already moved beyond him, and he had only just been informed. The officers left with instructions for return. Not resolution, not closure, just continuation. And when they were gone, the silence that returned felt less like peace and more like removal. He stood in the yard for a long time without speaking. She stood a few feet away. Neither of them moved toward the barn. Because something had changed fundamentally. Not between them, but around them. This is what you meant, he said finally. She didn't answer immediately, then quietly. Yes. He looked at her, not with anger now. Not even frustration. Something heavier. Recognition. You never belonged here, he said. A pause. I never said I did, she replied. That was true, and that was the problem. Because he had started behaving as if she did. He looked toward the corral. The horse stood quietly, unaware of legal language, unaware of transfer authority, unaware of systems that defined its existence in ways it could not understand it. Not about the horse anymore, he said. No, she agreed. Silence again. Then he asked the question he had been avoiding since the moment this stopped being simple. What happens now? She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, but because she did. And whatever that answer was, it wasn't going to be easy for either of them. Finally, she said softly, Now, you decide whether you protect what you own or what you understand. And for the first time since the chase began, The man who had followed a stolen horse across broken land realized something he hadn't been prepared for. The real conflict was no longer about possession. It was about what kind of person he was willing to become. When possession stopped certain, the decision didn't arrive the way he expected it would. There was no final argument. No last confrontation that neatly divided right from wrong. No dramatic moment where everything became clear and clean enough to act without doubt. Instead, it came in fragments, small, persistent realizations that kept returning, no matter how often he tried to push them away. The ranch was quiet that morning, in a way that didn't feel natural anymore. Not peaceful, measured, like the land itself was waiting for him to decide what kind of ending it would be allowed to have. He stood in the barn doorway for a long time before stepping inside. She was already there. Of course, she was. She had been there in every version of the story since the beginning, even when he didn't understand what role she was playing. The horse stood between them, calm as always. That calm now felt like a third voice in the conversation, one that refused to acknowledge human systems entirely. "You didn't sleep," she said without looking at him. "I did," he replied. "Just not much." She nodded once, as if that was enough information to continue existing in the same space. He moved slowly inside, stopping near the post he had leaned against. So many times it had begun to feel like part of his body. "They be coming back today." "I know," she said. He studied her for a moment longer than he intended to. "You always know things before they happen," he said, a faint pause. "I notice patterns," she replied. That answer should have felt simple. It didn't, because patterns were what systems ran on, and systems were what had brought everything here. He exhaled slowly, then finally said it. "They were going to take the horse." She didn't react immediately. Not denial, not resistance, just stillness. That stillness was becoming the most honest thing about her. "Yes," she said after a moment. The word landed without resistance. That was what made it heavier. He turned slightly away, running a hand over the rough wood of the post. "And you going with them?" "Yes," she repeated. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it. He nodded, slowly, as if confirming something he had already known, but refused to name. Silence settled between them. Outside, wind moved lightly through the yard, carrying dust that shimmered briefly in the sunlight, before falling back into the ground like nothing had happened. He finally asked, "If I stop them, what happens to you?" She looked at him then, directly. For the first time in a long time, there was something exposed in her expression. Not fear, exactly, but the absence of illusion. "Then nothing changes for me," she said quietly. "It only changes what it costs you." That sentence stayed in the air longer than the others, because it was not a warning. It was truth. He understood that immediately, and it unsettled him more than any threat would have. They didn't speak for a while after that. There was nothing left in the conversation that could be resolved with words alone. Everything now existed in consequence, not intention. He walked outside without announcing it. She followed at a distance, not because she was asked, but because there was nowhere else for her to be within the structure of what was about to happen. The horse was brought out into the yard. That simple act changed everything again. Not emotionally, legally, visibly. The Officer S truck arrived earlier than expected. No hesitation this time. No negotiation energy. Only finality. The same officer stepped out, folder already open before his boots touched the ground. "This is the final retrieval notice," he said. The words were procedural. But final is always emotional, even when spoken without emotion. The protagonist stepped forward. "You were not taking it," he said again. The officer looked at him calmly. You already been informed of the ruling. I don't accept it. That is not relevant. That sentence, simple, so absolute, hit harder than anything before it, because it confirmed what he had been resisting for days. Acceptance was no longer part of the system, only compliance. Behind him, she stepped forward slightly, not toward the officer, toward the horse. The officer noticed immediately. You will step back, he said. She didn't move, but she also didn't resist. And somehow, that balance between stillness and defiance made everything sharper. The protagonist looked at her, then at the horse, then at the officer. And for the first time, he realized the choice was not between law and emotion. It was between two kinds of loss. One immediate, one permanent. He exhaled slowly, then said quietly, "What if I take responsibility for everything?" The officer paused. That was not the expected question. "Clarify," the officer said. The protagonist turned slightly toward the document folder, the horse, the property, the dispute, all of it. The officer narrowed his eyes slightly. That would require legal assumption of full liability. I understand. A pause. Behind him, she didn't speak, but he felt her attention shift toward him. The officer studied him longer now. You would be relinquishing contest rights, the officer said. I don't care about rights, he replied. That sentence changed the air again, because it removed leverage, and systems did not like when leverage disappeared. The officer looked at the assistant briefly, then back at him. This is irreversible, he said. I know. Silence followed. Longer this time. He could feel it, every second stretching, every possible future branching away from this moment and collapsing into different versions of consequence. Finally, the officer spoke again. Submit formal declaration. The paperwork was simple, too simple for what it meant. He signed it standing in the yard, the sound of pen against paper absurdly quiet compared to everything it was changing. When he finished, the officer took the folder without ceremony. The horse remained in place, not moved, not claimed, not lost, just reassigned in the eyes of a system that no longer required argument. The officer nodded once, then left. No victory, no resolution, only completion. When the truck disappeared down the road, the silence that remained felt different than all the silences before it. This one was not waiting. It was finished. He stood still for a long moment, looking at the empty space where authority had just been. Then he turned slowly toward her. She was still standing near the horse, not moving, not reacting, just present. He walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly, just with intention that had finally found direction. When he stopped in front of her, neither of them spoke immediately. Then he said, "It's done." "Yes," she replied, a pause. Then he added, quieter, "You re-free." That word landed differently than he expected. She didn't look relieved. She didn't look surprised. She looked steady, as if freedom was not a destination, but a condition she had learned to live inside regardless of circumstance. "I was never going to stay," she said softly. He nodded. "I know." Silence again. The horse shifted slightly behind her, breaking the stillness just enough to remind them both that life continued even when decisions felt final. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You never asked me to do that." "No," she agreed. "Then why did I?" That question was accusation. It was recognition of something he didn't fully really understand yet. She looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because you finally understood the difference between ownership and responsibility," she said. That answer didn't feel like explanation. It felt like closure, not between them. But within him she left before sunset, not dramatically, not slowly, just with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning. The horse went with her, not as property, not as evidence, but as something that no longer belonged to systems that needed permission to exist. He stood at the fence line as they disappeared into the distance. The wind moved across the land like it always had, but now it felt different, not emptier, not fuller, just honest. And for the first time since the chase began, he understood that what he had been following was never just a stolen horse. It had been a question. One he had finally answered, not with possession, not with law, but with choice. The ranch did not feel empty after she left. It felt recalibrated. That was the only way he could describe it. Standing alone in the yard as the light shifted toward evening and the wind moved through the fences like it had done 1,000 times before. Nothing about the landscape had changed. The barn still stood, the corral still held its shape. The same dry grasses still bent under the same steady pressure of weather. And yet everything was different. Because now there was no longer a decision waiting to be made, only the consequences of the one he had already chosen. He walked slowly through the yard, not because he was searching for anything, but because stillness felt unfamiliar after everything that had passed through this place. His boots pressed into the ground with a rhythm that felt almost borrowed, like the land was allowing him to remain on it without fully acknowledging why. When he reached the barn, he stopped at the doorway. The empty stall where the horse had stood now looked ordinary again. Just wood, space, and dust, settling into corners that had never mattered before. But his eyes lingered there longer than they should have, as if expecting memory to behave like presence. It didn't he? Memory stayed where it belonged. He stepped inside anyway. The smell of hay and leather remained unchanged. The tools were still where they had always been. The routines of the place had not been broken, only interrupted. That distinction mattered more than he expected. Broken things demanded repair. Interrupted things simply continued when time allowed. He moved through the barn slowly, touching nothing, only observing what remained of a life that had briefly expanded beyond its usual boundaries. At the far end, he paused near the post where he had stood so many times during the past weeks. That same post had once felt like a place of judgment, negotiation, confusion. Now it felt like a marker of something completed, not resolved, completed. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying dust across the open land in thin, moving lines. He watched it for a long time, letting the silence settle fully around him. He thought about the first morning, the stolen horse, the chase, the assumption that justice would be simple if he just followed it far enough. It hadn't been simple. It had never been simple. And that was the lesson he hadn't known he needed to learn. The land did not care about ownership the way people did. It only cared about what survived on it, and what people were willing to become in order to survive alongside it. He exhaled slowly. There was no anger left in him now, not toward her, not toward the system, not even toward himself, only clarity, uncomfortable but steady. He stepped back outside. The sky was turning pale gold, the kind of light that made everything look like it had already been remembered before it happened. The ranch stretched out in front of him, vast and unchanged, yet no longer asking anything of him in the same way it used to. He stood there for a long time, not waiting, not deciding, just existing in the space between what had ended and what had not yet begun. Eventually, he turned and walked back toward the house. Not because he was done with the land, but because the land was no longer something he needed to chase in order to understand himself. It was simply where he stood now. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
At its core, this story is not really about a stolen horse. It is about what people choose to see when they are hurt, pressured, and trying to survive in a world that rarely gives them enough time or space to understand each other. The man begins the story believing in clarity. In his world, ownership has rules, law has structure, and right and wrong can be separated cleanly if someone is willing to enforce the line. When the horse is taken, his instinct is immediate: pursue, recover, restore order. That belief is not evil, it is human. It comes from a life where survival depends on control, and control depends on certainty. But the woman he follows does not live inside that same certainty. Her choices are not shaped by convenience or morality in the abstract sense. They are shaped by urgency, by loss, and by a reality where every decision carries a cost measured in human life, not legal terms. She does not steal because she lacks values, she steals because she is trapped in a situation where all available options are already compromised. As the story unfolds, both characters are forced into the same space, and what begins as accusation slowly transforms into understanding. The man starts to see that justice is not always something clean and external. Sometimes justice is tangled with suffering, history, and necessity. And the woman is also revealed not as a symbol of rebellion or crime, but as a person carrying burdens she cannot fully share without losing what little control she has left. One of the most important lessons in this story is the danger of judging actions without understanding context. What appears as wrongdoing on the surface may be survival in disguise, and what appears as authority or righteousness may sometimes be a failure to recognize human complexity. Another deeper message is about responsibility. The man eventually learns that protecting something does not always mean reclaiming it. Sometimes it means choosing understanding over possession, even when that choice carries personal loss. True strength is not found in control over others, but in the willingness to accept truth even when it disrupts one's sense of order. Ultimately, the story asks the audience to reconsider how quickly we assign blame, how easily we define people by their worst moments, and how rarely we pause long enough to ask why someone had no better choice. It reminds us that compassion is not weakness, it is awareness. And awareness, in a world shaped by hardship, is often the beginning of real justice.